The Americans with Disabilities Act, a fight for equal rights. On June 26, 1990, Evan Kipp, chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity, Justin Dart, chair of the President's Committee on Equal Employment for People with Disabilities, Reverend Harold Wicks, and Sandra Swift Perino, chairperson of the National Council on Disabilities, watched as George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act in the South Lawn of the White House. This bill would ensure the rights and responsibilities of people with disabilities across America. Before the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, was passed, life for students with disability was very challenging. Schools were not required to have ramps or elevators for students in wheelchairs. Students with disabilities would have to take regular school buses, relying on bus drivers to carry them on and off the bus. To address these changes, there was a need to recognize that people with disabilities needed accommodations. The Americans with Disabilities Act started with the civil rights movement and women's rights movement. As people with disabilities helped fight for civil rights and women's rights, they started taking notes on the strategies they used for these movements, like sit-ins and marches. In 1973, disabled rights activists were successful in incorporating Section 504 into the Rehabilitation Act. Section 504 meant that people with disabilities cannot be discriminated against. This act was modeled after Title VI and Title IX, which prevented discrimination against women and black people. 504 was the most important legal step in protecting people with disabilities. According to District of Columbia Public Schools, Section 504 is, quote, unlike special education, Section 504 provides accommodations and related services to eligible students with disabilities so that they can access the general education curriculum, opportunities for learning, and school activities to the same extent as their non-disabled peers. End quote. This means that students eligible to attend public schools would be subject to fair treatment. After Section 504 was passed, it was now time to devise regulations on how it should be implemented. The regulations help clarify that if you are treating everyone the same, you're actually discriminating against people with disabilities. When Ronald Reagan was elected president, he set up a task force on regulatory relief to remove all regulations in government. Remove Section 504 caused an outcry. Throughout people's advocacy, Section 504 was saved. Leaders of the disabled rights movement, members and staff of the U.S. Congress, and people in the federal government's civil rights agency agreed that there needed to be a law to help the disabled. Even though there was already Section 504, many parts of life weren't covered, like places without federal contracts. The National Council on Disabilities, NCD, or also known as the National Council on the Handicapped at the time, was the independent federal agency created to make recommendations to the President and Congress on policies affecting Americans with disabilities, took up this important issue. Led by Lex Friedman, a disabled rights activist and the head of the NCD, they came out with a report in February 1986 titled Towards Independence, an assessment of federal laws and programs affecting persons with disabilities. This report added an addition of new members like Dr. Michael Mard, NCD consultant attorney, and Robert Buffing, who drafted the first version of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The proposal of the first legislative step focused attention on the need for comprehensive legislation. It became the blueprints of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The United States Representative Tony Coelho of California and Sylviana Conti of Massachusetts introduced the House's version of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
I think of the ADA as being this really, really powerful civil rights law that can be used in all different kinds of contexts. So I think some people think of the ADA and they only think about like bathroom accessibility or parking spaces, and all of that is so important that we have physically accessible places for people with physical disabilities. But disabilities can mean all kinds of things, and the ADA is kind of there to protect people through different environments, different contexts.
Justin Dart, one of the presidentially appointed members of the National Council on Disabilities, took a leading role in building support. He made trips to all 50 states, getting people with disabilities to tell their everyday stories of difficulty and discrimination. This became known as the Discrimination Diary. One of the many examples in the diary was the story of Lisa Carl, 21-year-old woman born with a disease that put her in a wheelchair. At her neighborhood movie theater, Lisa was waiting in line to buy a ticket, but when she finally got to the ticket booth, she was denied entry. Later, when her mom called to ask why her daughter was denied entry, the owner said, "She can't even open the god-blank door. I don't want her in here and I don't have to let her in here." The owner stood her ground for 2 more years. This complicated story of discrimination was just one of many found throughout the discrimination diaries. Other stories include a man denied a modeling job because of his disability, or another man who was jailed for 95 days, but his wheelchair couldn't fit through the cell doors, so they took it away. In the end, he was jailed for 95 days, not able to move around. These records were delivered to Congress and formed a basis for the Americans with Disabilities Act. Then, after that, it got unanimously passed in the House and got signed in 1990.
The government has a responsibility to make their programs accessible to people. And that means it's on the government sometimes to come up with what do we have to change about the way we're doing this thing so that somebody who's blind or somebody with a mental health disability can also get the same service. And I think that's like a really hugely important responsibility. I think so many laws sometimes are about things that the government cannot do, like they cannot search your house without a warrant, or they can't, do XYZ thing. And those are really important laws. Those are rights that we have. But I think the really cool thing about the ADA is that it's not just about what the government can't do, it's about what the government is supposed to do.
Although it had a mostly positive result, there was a slight fall in employment because of concerns about the cost of further lawsuits. People with disabilities face systems that were not designed to accommodate all people, ranging from healthcare systems to criminal justice systems to employment and education. There are still people now trying to take away these accommodations granted in Section 504. In a recent lawsuit, Texas versus Garcia, that was filed last year, the Texas Attorney General is saying that Section 504 is unconstitutional because it makes the federal government ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. If this lawsuit succeeds, this would be a complete change from how Section 504 has been implemented for the last 50 years. This court case shows that even though the ADA is a law, the fight for equal rights for people with disability is not over. The ADA was more than access to buildings, using ramps, curb cuts, accessible parking, and modified entryways for people with disabilities. There are examples of the ADA all around us, like at the National Museum of American History. Next to Dorothy's slippers from The Wizard of Oz, there's a model for the blind. This adaptation ensures that everyone can experience the beauty of this iconic pair of slippers. The ADA had a long-term impact to change various parts of life, like buildings, transportation, and society. The ADA continues to make sure that there are reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities in the workplace and beyond.